Hey there, you're welcome to Skilldemy. In this video, we are going to look at how statistically we can interpret p-value. If this is your first time, do not forget to like, share, and subscribe to our page for more subsequent educative content on data analytics. Alright, so when we say a p-value, what is a p-value? Now, in statistics, a p-value is the probability of obtaining results as extreme as the observed data, assuming that the null hypothesis is true. So it's basically the probability of us getting a result that is a close reflection, or that is a true reflection of our data sets, or it's the probability of obtaining a result that is a true reflection of our sample size or the population or the phenomenon that we are investigating. Assuming that the null hypothesis, we are holding the null hypothesis to be true, that becomes a p-value. Now, a p-value does not tell you whether your hypothesis is true or false. Okay, it does not tell you that your initial assumption that you are holding is true at the end of the day, or it is false at the end of the day. A p-value only tells you how compatible your data set is with the null hypothesis. Okay, is with the null hypothesis. Now we are talking about p-value, but you realize that we have shifted onto hypothesis. Now, in order to understand a p-value, you will need to understand what a research hypothesis is. And that brings us to the meaning of hypothesis. Now, when we say a research hypothesis, it is basically a prediction of the possible outcome of our investigation. So, a research hypothesis becomes an assumption of the future outcome. So, let's say we want to run a survey on the effect of teenage pregnancy on girl-child education. So we want to investigate whether teenage pregnancy affects a girl-child education. Now, our hypothesis is going to be that teenage pregnancy has an effect on girl-child education. So what we are saying is that even though we have not started the work, we are hypothetically saying that at the end of the day, we will realize that the data set that we are going to collect, we will realize that teenage pregnancy has an impact on girl-child education. So that becomes a hypothesis. So a research hypothesis is basically a prediction of the possible outcome of your inquiry or your investigation. Now, before we understand the impact of a hypothesis in our research, we need to know that research hypotheses are in two ways. So we have a null hypothesis and we have alternative hypothesis. If you remember, we've already mentioned a null hypothesis. So this is the implication of a null hypothesis. Now, when we say a null hypothesis or H-nut, it's a statement that establishes no relationship between steady variables. So a null hypothesis always indicates no relationship existing between any of the steady variables that we are looking at. So when we are saying that we want to find out the effect of girl-child education, or when we say we want to find out the effect of teenage pregnancy on girl-child education, a null hypothesis will be that the teenage pregnancy has no effects on girl-child education. Okay, teenage pregnancy has no effect on girl-child education, and that is going to be our null hypothesis. So just going over again, a null hypothesis establishes no relationship between steady variables. Then we move on to what we call the alternative hypothesis, or the H1 or the HA. Now, alternative hypothesis is basically the opposite of a null hypothesis. So whilst null hypothesis establishes no relationship existing between steady variables, an alternative hypothesis establishes a relationship between the steady variables. So alternative hypothesis becomes a statement that describes that there is a relationship between two or more selected variables in a study. So let's say we are still working with the effect of teenage pregnancy on girl child education. Now, what an alternative hypothesis is going to establish is that teenage pregnancy has an effect on girl child education. Now, that being said, how do we properly and statistically interpret p-values in light of hypotheses that we have already looked at? Now, in statistics, we interpret a p-value using a significance level, normally a threshold of 5%. So we use 5% as our benchmark in interpreting a p-value. Now, when you run an analysis where you have your p-value that is less than your significance level, okay, when you run an analysis that you have a p-value less than your significance level, or less than 5%, or less than 0.05, it means that we reject our null hypothesis. And remember, like we said, the null hypothesis establishes no relationship between the study variables. So when we run a test that we have a result, a p-value of less than or equal to 0.05, it means that we reject our null hypothesis. And what is our null hypothesis? Our null hypothesis establishes no relationship. So this means that a p-value of less than 5%, or less than or equal to 5%, means that our result is statistically significant. However, we reject the null hypothesis, and it is because our null hypothesis establishes no relationship. Now, when you run an analysis where you have a p-value that is greater than your significance level, or it is greater than 0.05, it means that your result is not significant, and that means that we fail, or we will fail to reject your null hypothesis. Okay, I hope you are not confused. Now, the thing is that the null hypothesis establishes no relationship. So when you run a test that you have a p-value that is less than or equal to 5%, or that is less than or equal to 0.05, it means that your result is statistically significant. That being said, we will reject the null hypothesis because our null hypothesis is telling us that there is no relationship, yet we are finding out that the relationship is actually existing and it is significant. But when you run a test where you have your p-value that is greater than 5% or 0.05, it means that we fail to reject the null hypothesis. In statistics, we do not say that we accept. Okay, we either reject or we fail to reject. Now, when we fail to reject something, it means that we are accepting it. Okay, that is how we interpret this in statistics. You can watch our videos on how to interpret hypothesis in detail in other videos that we have. Thank you for watching. Bye bye.